September 19th, 1944, 7:23 in the morning. The sun was a pale, useless disk, a rumor of light behind a thick, suffocating blanket of fog that clung to the fields and forests around the small French town of Haraucourt. In the Meurthe-et-Moselle region, the world had been reduced to a gray, claustrophobic bubble of no more than 50 yards. Visibility was a cruel joke. Sound was a liar, distorted and muffled by the damp, heavy air. For the men of Company C, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, this fog was both a shield and a shroud. It hid them from the hunters, but it also hid the hunters from them. It was a cold, damp purgatory, a gray limbo pregnant with the promise of imminent violence. In the valley below, scattered, isolated, and perilously overextended, were the advance elements of the 4th Armored Division. They were the very tip of General George S. Patton's 3rd Army Spear, having pushed deeper and faster into occupied France than any other Allied force. Their audacious drive was the stuff of headlines back home, but here, on the ground, speed had a price. In their race across France, they had created a salient, a vulnerable, exposed bulge in the American lines that beckoned a counterattack like a raw, open wound. And now, that attack was coming. Operation Lüttich, Hitler's ambitious counteroffensive in Normandy, had failed spectacularly, but the German war machine, though wounded, was still ferociously lethal. The remnants of its Panzer brigades, hastily refitted with brand-new Panther tanks and filled with bitter, experienced crews drawn from the Russian front, were now being hurled at this very sector. For the American tankers and infantrymen in the valley, their aggressive, triumphant advance had suddenly and terrifyingly become a desperate fight for survival. They had driven into what they thought was the enemy's collapsing heartland. Instead, it had become a meticulously planned death trap. Inside his M18 Hellcat, its Wright R975 radial engine idling with a low, throaty purr that seemed like the only warm thing in the world, Lieutenant Edwin Leiper felt the cold dampness of the morning seep into his bones. It was a physical manifestation of the dread that permeated the air. The atmosphere inside the open-topped turret was a thick cocktail of smells: wet earth, hot metal, the sweet scent of high-octane gasoline, the faint odor of gun oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of collective, unspoken fear. The radio crackled to life, a disembodied voice from battalion headquarters, its calm, measured tones utterly, obscenely disconnected from the tactile reality of their position. All C Company units, this is Badger 6. Hold your current positions. I repeat, all units hold. Do not advance. Do not engage unless directly engaged. Await clearing weather for air support. Acknowledge. It was a death sentence, delivered with the serene procedural detachment of a man looking at grease pencil marks on a map miles away from the front line. To hold was to be found. To be found by German Panther tanks in this fog, on their terms, was to be systematically, clinically, and inevitably destroyed. Leiper looked down at the weapon at his command, the machine that was supposed to be America's answer to the Panther. The M18 Hellcat was a magnificent, terrifying paradox. It was the fastest tracked vehicle of the entire war, a 20-ton Predator that could hit speeds over 55 miles per hour on a good road. But its armor was a paper-thin lie, less than half an inch thick on its hull, a laughable defense against the cannons it was designed to hunt. It was a vehicle built on a singular, radical idea, a philosophy championed by the hard-driving, almost fanatical head of the tank destroyer school, General Andrew D. Bruce: speed is armor. The official doctrine, drilled into Leiper and every other tank destroyer commander in the blistering heat of Fort Hood, Texas, was an aggressive, offensive creed: seek, strike, and destroy. It was a hunter's mantra. But there was a critical, unspoken corollary to this mantra, the part that actually kept crews alive. You only engage on your terms. You use your breathtaking speed to achieve a flanking position, to strike at the enemy's weaker side and rear armor, and then to vanish like a ghost before they can bring their superior slow-turning guns to bear. This was the core of their training, the very soul of the tank destroyer concept. But the order from headquarters was to hold. It was a direct, crippling contradiction of their entire existence. It was a command to become a static, thin-skinned target. It was an order to negate their only true, life-saving advantage, and to allow the German Panthers, with their thickly sloped frontal armor that could shrug off American shells, and their long-barreled, high-velocity 75mm guns that could punch through a Sherman at 1,000 yards, to methodically hunt them down and pick them off in the fog. It was an order to die by the book. Leiper looked at the map spread across his lap, the grease pencil markings showing the likely German axis of advance along the main road. He listened, filtering out the static on the radio, focusing instead on the low, guttural growl of powerful engines, much closer now, a sound that vibrated up through the very soil beneath his tracks. It was the sound of approaching predators, confident in their steel and their mission. And in that moment, faced with the impossible choice between following a suicidal order and embracing a monumental, career-ending risk, he made his decision. The faces of his crew, young men who trusted him with their lives, flashed in his mind. "Jenkins," he said, his voice quiet but firm, a stark act of defiance against the crackling radio. "Forward, slow. Let's go find them before they find us." It was a monumental gamble, a flagrant violation of a direct command that would either save the 200 men in the valley and halt the German spearhead, or it would be the last and the shortest decision he ever made. To truly understand the decision Lieutenant Leiper made in the fog that morning, a decision that flew in the face of orders, protocol, and the ingrained instinct for self-preservation, you have to understand the philosophy that created him. The American tank destroyer doctrine was a direct, almost panicked response to the psychological terror of the German blitzkrieg that had crushed the armies of Europe in 1940. American military planners, men like the brilliant but controversial Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair and the deeply influential, almost evangelical Colonel Andrew D. Bruce, watched in horror as newsreels and intelligence reports showed massed panzer formations punching through Allied lines with impunity, encircling and annihilating entire armies in a matter of days. Their stunning conclusion was that a new type of weapon, and more importantly, a new type of soldier, was needed to counter this existential threat. They envisioned a force that would not engage in ponderous toe-to-toe slugging matches with heavy tanks. That was a game the Americans at the time could not win. Instead, this new force would act as a mobile, aggressive, almost predatory reserve, rushing to intercept and ambush armored breakthroughs at their weakest points. The motto they coined, "Seek, Strike, and Destroy," was more than a slogan. It was an ethos. It demanded initiative, audacity, speed, and a cold, calculating hunter's instinct. This doctrine gave birth to the M18 Hellcat, a vehicle that was the physical embodiment of this radical philosophy. Built by the Buick division of General Motors, it was a marvel of automotive engineering, a testament to American industrial might, but one that horrified traditional armored officers. To achieve its blistering, world-beating speed, armor protection was sacrificed to an almost reckless degree.
Its frontal armor was a mere 12.7 millimeters thick, less than many armored cars. Its open-topped turret, while providing unparalleled visibility for the commander, left the crew dangerously exposed to artillery bursts, shrapnel, and even small arms fire from elevated positions. To a German tanker, buttoned up inside the steel fortress of a Panther, the Hellcat looked like a design flaw, a fatal misunderstanding of modern warfare. But to the men who crewed them, this vulnerability was the very source of their strength. It forged a unique and necessary mindset. It forced them to be smarter, faster, and more audacious than their opponents. They could not afford to be hit, so they learned to never be where the enemy expected them to be. They learned to think not in terms of armor, but in terms of angles, terrain, time, and deception. The men who gravitated to these machines were often a breed apart. They were not the methodical, deliberate tankers of the Sherman battalions. They were risk-takers, mavericks, individualists with a feel for the land and an intuitive understanding of the deadly geometry of warfare. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper was in many ways the archetypal Hellcat commander. Before the war, he had been a land surveyor in the rolling, unpredictable hills of rural Pennsylvania. His civilian life was a quiet, meticulous study of the earth. His father, also a surveyor, had taught him a fundamental lesson as a boy. The map is a lie, not a deliberate one, but an oversimplification. A contour line doesn't show you the soft ground after a rain, the hidden axle-breaking ditch obscured by summer grass, or the way the morning mist settles first and thickest in a river hollow. He spent his days walking the contours of the land, understanding how a shallow depression could hide a man or a vehicle, how a distant tree line could mask a silent approach, and how the subtle crest of a ridge could offer a fleeting moment of superior position and then a quick, life-saving escape. He saw the world in 3 dimensions, in gradients, rises and falls. He didn't just see a landscape, he saw a tactical map of concealment, ambush, and opportunity. This innate skill, honed over years of painstaking peacetime work, now made him preternaturally gifted at solving the lethal puzzles of the battlefield.
Now, in September 1944, Leiper and his men found themselves at the sharpest, most dangerous end of the Allied advance. As part of the 4th Armored Division, they were a key component of Patton's audacious, high-speed drive across France. But this rapid advance, while spectacular, had stretched their supply lines, the famous Red Ball Express, to the absolute breaking point and left their flanks dangerously exposed. The Germans, reeling from their cataclysmic defeat in the Falaise pocket, were desperately trying to stabilize the front. They had scraped together what remained of their armored forces on the Western Front, including the newly formed 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades of Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, and thrown them into a desperate, powerful counterattack aimed directly at Patton's spearhead near the town of Haraucourt. These were not the green troops the Allies had faced on the Normandy beaches. These were bitter, hardened veteran crews commanding the formidable Panther tank, a machine that decisively outgunned and outarmored both the Sherman tank and the M18 Hellcat in any conceivable frontal engagement. Leiper's platoon, a small part of C Company of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, was a microcosm of the American Army, a melting pot of backgrounds forged by the heat of training and the terror of combat into a single, efficient killing machine. His gunner was Sergeant Javier, a.k.a. J. Delgado, a quiet, almost stoic former farmhand from the flat, endless plains of Texas. Delgado rarely spoke, but his hands on the turret traverse and gun elevation controls were as steady and precise as a surgeon's, his preternatural calm a source of strength for the entire crew.
The driver, Corporal Sam Jenkins from Chicago, was a fearless hot rod enthusiast before the war, a man who treated the 20-ton, 400-horsepower Hellcat like the custom Ford Roadster he'd left back home, with a feel for its power, its torque, and its limits. And the loader, Private First Class Michael O'Connell, a fast-talking, irrepressible kid from Boston, could slam a 25-pound, 76mm shell into the breech in under 5 seconds, all while keeping up a running commentary of insults aimed at the German army, a habit that served as his own personal pressure release valve. These men had trained together for months in the dust of Texas, fought their way across France, and trusted each other with the casual, unspoken intimacy of men who know their very lives depend not on the thickness of their armor, but on their flawless coordination and on their lieutenant's uncanny ability to read the battlefield. As they pushed forward into the fog, a solitary act of defiance against a direct order, the situation around them was rapidly, violently deteriorating. The radio net, once calm and procedural, began to fill with the frantic, overlapping calls of men in desperate, life-and-death trouble. A reconnaissance unit, call sign Pathfinder, had stumbled directly into the main body of the Panther column. Their last transmission was a clipped, terrified shout, "Contact! Panthers! A dozen of them! We're—" followed by a piercing shriek of static. An infantry outpost on Hill 242 was being systematically overrun, their calls for artillery support going unanswered. The cool, detached voice from headquarters was now completely gone, replaced by the strained, high-pitched shouts of men in contact. "They're everywhere. We have Panthers on our flank. Repeat, we are being flanked. The crack of their 75s is different, louder." The official plan, to sit tight and wait for the fog to lift and for P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers to save them, was failing catastrophically. Time was running out. Leiper knew in his gut that every second he waited, every moment he hesitated, gave the German Panthers another second to close the net, to get into a hull-down firing position, and to begin the systematic, one-sided slaughter of the exposed and outnumbered American units. He was alone, cut off by the fog and by his own defiant decision, advancing blindly toward the sound of an enemy he could not yet see. The hunter had just knowingly, willingly stepped into the killing ground.
As Leiper's M18 crept forward through the ghostly, dripping silence of the French countryside, the rumbling of German engines grew from a distant, abstract threat into a visceral, gut-churning presence. It seemed to come from all directions at once, an omnipresent growl that the thick fog distorted and amplified into the sound of an entire army on the move. The very air itself seemed to vibrate with their approach, a low-frequency hum that you felt in your teeth and in your bones. Then a new sound cut through the tension, the sharp, rhythmic, metallic clang of tank treads on the paved road just ahead of them, hidden in the gray. They were close, dangerously, terrifyingly close. Leiper raised his binoculars to his eyes, but it was a futile gesture. His world was a swirling, impenetrable vortex of gray. He could see nothing beyond the length of a football field. But he could feel them. It was at that precise moment that years of walking the Pennsylvanian countryside, of feeling the subtle shift of the wind on his neck and watching the movement of morning mist in the valleys, coalesced into a single brilliant spark of insight. He wasn't just looking, he was observing. He noticed the way the fog eddied and flowed, not randomly, but with a slight, almost imperceptible drift. A faint, consistent breeze was blowing from west to east, from his hidden position towards the unseen German column on the road. It was a tiny, insignificant detail, the kind of subtle environmental observation that 99 out of 100 men, their minds clouded by fear and adrenaline, would have missed or dismissed as irrelevant. For Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, it was the key. It was the aha moment that changed everything.
He couldn't see the enemy, but he no longer needed to. He knew their doctrine as well as he knew his own. German armored columns, models of Teutonic efficiency, especially in conditions of poor visibility, would advance cautiously but methodically along predictable routes like roads, with infantry or panzer grenadiers flanking them in the fields. They would be disciplined, but they would be noisy, and today, most importantly, they would be blind. He formulated a plan in seconds, a wild, unorthodox gamble based on that faint breeze and a deep intuitive understanding of his enemy's psychology. He wasn't going to try and find the Panthers one by one in the fog, a suicidal game of hide-and-seek against a superior foe. He was going to make the entire German column believe they had driven headlong into a massive, perfectly prepared, and utterly lethal American ambush. He was going to fight them not with steel, but with their own well-founded fears. "Jenkins, pull us into that depression off the road to the right, hull down," Leiper commanded, his voice now electric with a newfound focused purpose that cut through the fear in the turret. "Delgado, listen to me carefully. Load Willie Pete. Aim for the center of the road. Estimate 200 yards ahead of the sounds." Willie Pete was the common Army slang for the M64 white phosphorus smoke shell. These rounds were not designed as offensive weapons against armor. Their purpose was to create smoke screens, to signal aircraft, to blind enemy observation posts. Using them in this manner as a primary tool of engagement to disorient and terrify an armored force was completely against protocol. It was a tactic you wouldn't find in any field manual, a solution born of pure desperation and unadulterated battlefield genius.
The Hellcat settled into a shallow ditch, its famously low profile disappearing almost completely into the landscape. "On the way," Delgado confirmed, his voice a steady, calming presence as he slammed the shell home into the breach. O'Connell called out, "Up! Fire!" Leiper ordered. The 76mm cannon barked, a sharp, violent crack that was immediately swallowed by the damp, heavy air. The shell soared through the gray emptiness and exploded on the unseen road with a dull thump, followed by a furious, almost organic hissing sound as the chemical payload ignited on contact with the air. Instantly, a massive cloud of brilliant white smoke erupted, thick and acrid, billowing outwards and upwards. But crucially, just as Leiper had calculated, it was caught by that gentle westerly breeze. It began to drift slowly, inexorably, down the length of the road, a rolling chemical curtain moving directly into the path of the advancing German column. From the German perspective, the effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Inside the lead Panther, Hauptmann Klaus Richter, a decorated veteran of the brutal, sprawling tank battles around Kursk, was peering through his vision slit, straining to see. One moment his world was gray, predictable fog. The next, it dissolved into an impenetrable, blinding wall of roiling white smoke. He slammed his fist on the turret interior in a mixture of frustration and alarm. What was this? An artillery strike? A prelude to a massive anti-tank ambush? He couldn't see a thing. His world-class Zeiss optics were utterly useless. Outside, the acrid smoke, smelling of burnt matches, stung the eyes of his flanking panzer grenadiers, forcing them to fall back, coughing, disoriented, and afraid. Confusion metastasized into professional, doctrine-driven fear. Was this the edge of a minefield being marked by engineers? Were American tank destroyers hidden and waiting in hull-down positions on both sides of the road, using the smoke to zero in on his position for a devastating, coordinated volley? German doctrine screamed that this was the classic, textbook sign of a prepared kill zone. The German advance, which had been moving with such confidence, ground to a shuddering, uncertain halt. Leiper didn't give them a moment to think, to reason, to regain their composure. Next round, 50 yards further down the road from the first. Fire! Delgado and O'Connell worked like a well-oiled, perfectly synchronized machine. Another Willie Pete shell screamed into the fog, creating a second brilliant pillar of smoke that merged with the first. Again, another 50 yards.
He was systematically walking the smoke down the road, creating a linear, overlapping screen that stretched for hundreds of yards. To the Germans, mired in confusion and total sensory deprivation, this wasn't the work of a single hidden tank destroyer firing in desperation. It sounded and looked like a full battery of artillery, precisely bracketing the road, laying down a perfectly coordinated textbook smokescreen to conceal a massive attack force. Hauptmann Richter's radio traffic, later intercepted by American signals intelligence, revealed the depth of his panic and his complete miscalculation of the situation. He reported being engaged by a significant enemy force of unknown size, and that his column was being bracketed for a major assault. He urgently requested permission to pull back and reconnoiter the American main line of resistance. In reality, it was just 4 men in a single, paper-thin tank destroyer, gambling everything on the direction of the wind and the corrosive, paralyzing power of fear. With the German spearhead now stalled, disoriented, and reporting a major enemy force, Leiper's gamble paid off in a way he hadn't even dared to hope for. The panicked radio calls from Richter's stalled column created a domino effect of chaos and hesitation all the way down the German line of march. Other American units, who had been on the verge of being overrun, now heard the threatening German engines stop. Emboldened, they began to fire into the fog in the direction of the enemy sounds. A Sherman crew from the 37th Tank Battalion, guided by the sound alone, fired 3 high-explosive rounds and was rewarded with the gratifying, thunderous roar of a secondary explosion as they blind-hit a German half-track carrying ammunition for the Panzer Grenadiers. The trap had been sprung, not by a massive force, but by the powerful, terrifying illusion of one. Under the cover of this manufactured chaos and the lingering, choking smokescreen, the scattered and isolated American units began a controlled collapse. They leapfrogged backward from one defensive position to the next, pulling themselves out of the closing noose, one vehicle at a time. Leiper's single Hellcat had become a ghost. It had created a phantom army that existed only in the minds of the German commanders. Hours later, when the fog finally began to burn off under the midday sun, the Germans advanced cautiously, expecting a bloody, protracted fight. They found nothing. Only a few of their own burning vehicles, abandoned equipment, and the lingering, chemical smell of white phosphorus hanging in the still air. The American units were gone, having slipped through their fingers. In their after-action reports, German officers would speak of a well-planned and heavily defended sector, of a ghost battery that had appeared out of nowhere to shatter their attack. They reported facing a much larger force, an entire company of tank destroyers lying in a perfectly prepared, interlocking ambush. The legend of Leiper's phantom attack was born, a powerful testament to the fact that on the battlefield, perception can be as deadly as any armor-piercing shell.
The immediate aftermath of Leiper's audacious action was a strange, surreal mix of battlefield chaos and profound collective relief. As the fog finally lifted around noon, the landscape revealed the stunning success of his gamble. The German advance had not only been halted, it had been thrown into complete, paralyzing confusion, a critical pause that allowed the scattered elements of the 4th Armored Division to consolidate their lines and prepare a proper, coordinated defense. The first people to understand what Leiper had truly accomplished were the men whose lives he had unquestionably saved. As his M18 pulled back to a new rally point, a mud-splattered, bone-weary lieutenant from a company of the 51st Armored Infantry approached him, his face a mask of grime, exhaustion, and unadulterated gratitude. "I don't know who was giving the orders out there," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting all morning, gesturing vaguely towards the direction of the earlier engagement, "but we were dead. We were absolutely dead. We had Panthers less than 200 yards from our foxholes, and we couldn't see a damn thing. We could hear their tracks squeaking. Then that smoke. That bought us the time we didn't have. It bought us our lives. Whatever that was, it worked." It was the first and perhaps the most meaningful recognition of his defiant, career-threatening act. But the official recognition, when it came, was of a very different and much colder kind. Later that afternoon, Leiper was summoned by radio to the Combat Command Headquarters, a hastily established post in a dilapidated, shell-pocked French farmhouse that smelled of damp stone, stale cigar smoke, and nervous sweat. He found himself standing at a rigid brace before his battalion commander, a stern, by-the-book West Point graduate named Major Harrison. Harrison was a man who lived and died by the field manual, a man who believed with religious fervor that discipline and protocol were the only things separating a professional army from an armed mob. Leiper could see the cold, controlled fury in his eyes. On the crude wooden table between them was the morning's radio log, its neat columns of times and call signs, a stark, bureaucratic indictment of Leiper's unorthodox success. "Lieutenant," Major Harrison began, his voice dangerously calm and devoid of emotion. "This log states that at 0723 hours you were given a direct and unambiguous order from this headquarters to hold your position. It further states that you acknowledge that order. Yet, subsequent reports from multiple units place your vehicle nearly a mile forward of that position, engaging the enemy with an unauthorized and profoundly wasteful tactic." The major tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the log sheet, a sharp, accusing sound in the quiet room. "You expended 3 rounds of M64 white phosphorus against what was presumed to be an armored column. That is a direct, flagrant violation of standing engagement protocols, as laid out in Field Manual 18-5, Paragraph 12, Section B. Smoke is for screening, Lieutenant, not for playing ghost games with the enemy. You abandoned your assigned position, you willfully disobeyed a direct order, and you wasted valuable, specialized munitions. Do you have anything at all to say for yourself?" The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Leiper stood ramrod straight, his face an unreadable mask of calm, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over the major's shoulder. He did not offer excuses. He did not try to justify his actions with tales of battlefield necessity or gut feelings. He simply stated the brutal, irrefutable logic of his situation in the plainest possible terms. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice steady and respectful but firm. "We would have died anyway. The Panthers were closing in on the road. Holding position was not a tactical option, sir. It was a suicide pact."
Before the enraged Major Harrison could respond and likely relieve Leiper of his command on the spot, another figure stepped out of the shadows of the farmhouse. It was Colonel Bruce Clark, the legendary commander of Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, a man known throughout the 3rd Army for his tactical brilliance and his complete intolerance for incompetence. Clark was a seasoned combat veteran, a man who understood that battles were not won in textbooks, but in the mud and blood and fear of the front lines. He had been listening to the entire exchange. "Major," Clark said, his voice carrying the easy, unquestionable authority of a man utterly comfortable with command. "Is it also in your report that the 113th Panzer Brigade's main axis of advance was stalled for nearly 2 hours this morning because of this ghost game? That because of that critical delay, we were able to successfully disengage the 51st Infantry and elements of the 37th Tank Battalion from a potential encirclement? That we only lost 3 vehicles in your sector this morning, instead of the entire company I was expecting to write off in my report to General Patton?" Major Harrison stood stunned into silence, his mouth slightly agape. Clark picked up a captured German map from the table, a map recovered from a destroyed vehicle, and traced the enemy's planned route of attack with his finger. The Germans believed they ran into a full company of TDs in a prepared ambush. Their own radio intercepts, which I just reviewed, confirm it. They were so convinced they pulled back their entire spearhead to reassess, giving us the breathing room we desperately needed to save our necks. Because your man played his ghost game, the 113th is now 6 hours behind schedule, and their entire offensive timetable for this sector is shut to hell." He looked directly at Leiper, his eyes appraising, analytical. "Your unauthorized tactic, Lieutenant, single-handedly broke the momentum of the German attack in this sector. It was a brilliant, inspired piece of fieldcraft." Turning back to the flustered Major, Clark's tone became as hard as steel. "There will be no disciplinary action. In fact, I want a full, detailed after-action report on Lieutenant Leiper's engagement. I want to know exactly what he did and how he did it. It might be something we need to teach." He then turned back to Leiper, and for the first time, a hint of smile touched the corners of his lips. "Son, you have a knack for turning nothing into something. Don't ever let a man with a textbook and a clean uniform beat that out of you." The vindication was absolute, but it was not public. There was no parade, no grand ceremony for the press. A week later, Leiper was quietly informed that he had been awarded the Bronze Star for valor. The medal wasn't pinned on his chest in front of his assembled company. It was handed to him, almost as an afterthought, by Major Harrison in that same farmhouse office. Harrison, still stiff and formal, simply cleared his throat and said, "The citation is for meritorious service in a combat action. Don't let it go to your head, Lieutenant." It was the closest the by-the-book Major could ever come to admitting he had been wrong. The reward was humble, almost dismissive, but it perfectly reinforced Leiper's status as an unsung genius, a man whose true contribution would never be fully appreciated by the bureaucracy of war, only by the men who were there to see it, and whose lives now depended on it.
The ripples from Lieutenant Leiper's actions in the fog at Aracourt spread far beyond that single engagement, far beyond the gratitude of the men he saved or the grudging respect of his superiors. While Colonel Clark saw the immediate, crucial tactical victory, the logisticians and strategists further up the chain of command, the men who thought about war in terms of cost and effect, of inputs and outputs, saw something else entirely. A stunningly, almost absurdly effective use of resources. An entire German Panzer column, representing millions of dollars in military hardware and thousands of man-hours of elite training, had been stopped cold, its attack shattered, its timetable ruined, by 3 smoke shells, which cost the U.S. government about $80 apiece. It was an almost comical asymmetry, a profound lesson in psychological warfare that was not lost on the men whose job it was to write the manuals and prepare the next generation of soldiers for the next war. In the months that followed, after the Battle of Aracourt had concluded as a major American victory and a turning point on the Lorraine front, the after-action reports from the engagement were studied intensely at the Tank Destroyer School back at Fort Hood, Texas. General Bruce himself, the architect of the entire doctrine, took a personal interest in the report filed by Colonel Clark. Leiper's unauthorized tactic, initially a source of disciplinary consternation for a by-the-book major, was now a subject of intense academic interest for the men shaping the future of the force. By the spring of 1945, as the Allies were closing in on the heart of Germany, a new training bulletin was quietly circulated among all tank destroyer battalions still in training and in the field. It was given a dry, forgettable, technical name: Field Manual 18-5, Addendum 7, Non-Standard Obscurant Deployment for Armored Deception. It was a fancy, bureaucratic term for a deceptively simple and brilliant idea. The bulletin read, in part, "In conditions of limited visibility, the tactical deployment of smoke munitions can be used to simulate a large, prepared defensive position, thereby causing a cautious enemy to halt his advance and misallocate his fire support assets. The effect is psychological rather than physical, aiming to disrupt the enemy's command and control and decision-making cycle."
In other words, don't just use smoke to hide yourself, use it to create a phantom army in the mind of your enemy. Don't aim for the front of the tank, aim for the collapse of the enemy commander's confidence. A tactic born of one man's desperation, his intimate knowledge of terrain, and his defiance of orders, had been studied, codified, and integrated into official United States Army doctrine. The ultimate proof of genius is when the forbidden becomes the standard. The most powerful validation, however, came not from the strategists in their classrooms, but from the archived memories of the men who witnessed it firsthand. Years after the war, in the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the collected letters and diaries of the men from the 4th Armored Division paint a vivid, ground-level picture. A private first class named Harold Jensen, a rifleman in the 51st Armored Infantry, wrote a letter to his parents dated September 25, 1944. He wrote, "We were caught good and proper, panthers all around us in the fog. We were saying our prayers. We thought we were done for. Their engines were so loud it felt like they were in the foxhole with us. Then the strangest thing happened. Someone out in the gray started popping smoke shells right down the road the Germans were using. It spooked them bad. They stopped dead in their tracks, and their infantry, who were almost on us, pulled back. It gave us the chance to get out. I don't know the name of the guy in the tank destroyer who fired those rounds, but I know this. I owe him everything." After the war, Edwin Leiper's life returned to a quiet, unassuming normalcy that stood in the starkest possible contrast to the high-stakes drama of the battlefield. He went back to Pennsylvania, back to his career as a land surveyor. He married his sweetheart, raised a family, and, like so many of his generation, he rarely spoke of the war. His Bronze Star sat in a small wooden box in a desk drawer, a quiet, tangible reminder of a single, foggy morning in France. He went back to walking the same hills he had before he left, but now he saw them with different eyes, forever imprinted with the memory of how the lay of the land, the direction of the wind, and the fall of a shadow could mean the difference between life and death. To his neighbors and to his children, he was just Ed Leiper, the quiet, dependable man who knew the land better than anyone. They had no idea that this same quiet man had once outwitted and defeated an entire German Panzer column with nothing more than the wind and 3 rounds of $80 smoke. The emotional climax of his story, the deepest insight into the man himself and the burden of the choice he made, would not be revealed until decades later. In a letter to his son, dated October 20, 1982, found in his papers after his death, Leiper finally, in his own words, explained the why behind his monumental decision. He wrote, "You asked me once if I was scared that day. Of course I was. Anyone who says they weren't is a liar or a fool. But the training at Fort Hood under General Bruce, it wasn't just about how to operate the vehicle or shoot the gun. They taught us a way of thinking. They taught us that the M18's greatest weakness, its paper-thin skin, was also its greatest strength. It demanded that we be smarter, that we think our way out of problems that others would try to shoot their way out of. That morning in the fog, the manual, the direct order, everything by the book said to sit still and die. My instincts, my understanding of the land, and the aggressive hunting philosophy they had drilled into us, it all screamed at me to do something else. The book couldn't see the fog. The book couldn't feel the breeze. The book couldn't see the faces of Jenkins and Delgado and O'Connell. That day, the battlefield taught me something no manual ever could. That sometimes the only right choice, the only choice that leads to tomorrow, is the one they didn't teach you to make." And maybe that's the real lesson of the M18 Hellcat and the generation of unsung geniuses like Ed Leiper who crewed them. That in the brutal calculus of war, victory is not always forged in the thickest armor or the biggest gun, but in the quiet, defiant, and brilliant decisions of a junior officer who trusted his own eyes over his orders. That sometimes history doesn't remember you for what you were ordered to do, but for what you chose to do when no one else would.
The most powerful validation, however, came not from the strategists in their classrooms, but from the archived memories of the men who witnessed it firsthand. Years after the war, in the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the collected letters and diaries of the men from the 4th Armored Division paint a vivid, ground-level picture. A private first class named Harold Jensen, a rifleman in the 51st Armored Infantry, wrote a letter to his parents dated September 25, 1944. He wrote, "We were caught good and proper, panthers all around us in the fog. We were saying our prayers. We thought we were done for. Their engines were so loud it felt like they were in the foxhole with us. Then the strangest thing happened. Someone out in the gray started popping smoke shells right down the road the Germans were using. It spooked them bad. They stopped dead in their tracks, and their infantry, who were almost on us, pulled back. It gave us the chance to get out. I don't know the name of the guy in the tank destroyer who fired those rounds, but I know this. I owe him everything." After the war, Edwin Leiper's life returned to a quiet, unassuming normalcy that stood in the starkest possible contrast to the high-stakes drama of the battlefield. He went back to Pennsylvania, back to his career as a land surveyor. He married his sweetheart, raised a family, and, like so many of his generation, he rarely spoke of the war. His bronze star sat in a small wooden box in a desk drawer, a quiet, tangible reminder of a single, foggy morning in France. He went back to walking the same hills he had before he left, but now he saw them with different eyes, forever imprinted with the memory of how the lay of the land, the direction of the wind, and the fall of a shadow could mean the difference between life and death. To his neighbors and to his children, he was just Ed Leiper, the quiet, dependable man who knew the land better than anyone. They had no idea that this same quiet man had once outwitted and defeated an entire German Panzer column with nothing more than the wind and 3 rounds of $80 smoke. The emotional climax of his story, the deepest insight into the man himself and the burden of the choice he made, would not be revealed until decades later. In a letter to his son, dated October 20, 1982, found in his papers after his death, Leiper finally, in his own words, explained the why behind his monumental decision. He wrote, "You asked me once if I was scared that day. Of course I was. Anyone who says they weren't is a liar or a fool. But the training at Fort Hood under General Bruce, it wasn't just about how to operate the vehicle or shoot the gun. They taught us a way of thinking. They taught us that the M18's greatest weakness, its paper-thin skin, was also its greatest strength. It demanded that we be smarter, that we think our way out of problems that others would try to shoot their way out of. That morning in the fog, the manual, the direct order, everything by the book, said to sit still and die. My instincts, my understanding of the land, and the aggressive, hunting philosophy they had drilled into us, it all screamed at me to do something else. The book couldn't see the fog. The book couldn't feel the breeze. The book couldn't see the faces of Jenkins and Delgado and O'Connell. That day, the battlefield taught me something no manual ever could, that sometimes the only right choice, the only choice that leads to tomorrow, is the one they didn't teach you to make." And maybe that's the real lesson of the M18 Hellcat and the generation of unsung geniuses like Ed Leiper who crewed them. That in the brutal calculus of war, victory is not always forged in the thickest armor or the biggest gun, but in the quiet, defiant, and brilliant decisions of a junior officer who trusted his own eyes over his orders. That sometimes history doesn't remember you for what you were ordered to do, but for what you chose to do when no one else would.